The sun rises over the marble columns of the Roman Forum, casting long shadows across a city that, in the first century, believed itself to be eternal. This is the heart of an empire that spans from the rain-swept highlands of Scotland to the sun-scorched sands of the Euphrates. It is a world connected by 50,000 miles of paved roads, protected by 30 elite legions, and fueled by a single shimmering piece of silver, the Denarius. To the citizens of Rome, their world felt as permanent as the mountains. Their currency was the undisputed global reserve. But history has a cruel way of teaching us that permanence is an illusion. If you could peel back the gold leaf and the triumphal arches, you would find a rot that had already begun to set in. It wasn't a military weakness, and it wasn't a lack of political will. It was a slow, invisible, and irreversible suicide of the currency. The fall of Rome wasn't an event. It was a process of debasement that looks hauntingly familiar to anyone watching the financial headlines today. To understand how the most powerful economy in human history vaporized, we have to go back to the beginning, to the Golden Age of Augustus. In 27 BC, Augustus became the first emperor, inheriting a republic shattered by decades of civil war. He knew that to maintain peace, he needed two things: a loyal army and a stable currency. He standardized the denarius at a purity of roughly 95 to 98% silver. This was sound money. Because the coin had intrinsic value, a merchant in the port of Alexandria knew exactly what his goods were worth in Rome. Trust was the bedrock of the Pax Romana. If a Roman soldier was promised a pension in silver, he knew that 20 years later, that silver would still buy him a plot of land and a herd of cattle. For over a century, this system worked. Rome became the center of a global trade network that would not be rivaled until the British Empire nearly 2,000 years later. Silks from China, spices from India, and grain from Egypt flowed into the city, all paid for with the trusted silver of the empire. But the Roman dream was built on a fundamental flaw. The empire was a parasitic organism. It didn't produce wealth through industrial innovation or technology. It extracted wealth through conquest. Every time a new province was added, its gold and silver were looted, its people were enslaved, and its land was taxed. This windfall of stolen wealth funded the spectacular growth of the city. But by the time of the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century, the expansion hit a wall. To the north, the thick forests of Germania were too costly to hold. To the east, the Persian Empire was a peer competitor that couldn't be broken. To the south, the Sahara was an impassable barrier. For the first time, Rome had to live within its means. It had to survive on its internal tax revenue. However, the Roman government had already developed an addiction to spending that exceeded its tax base. The deep state of Rome was massive. There was the Praetorian Guard, the elite secret service that protected and often murdered the emperors who demanded massive bonuses to keep them loyal. There were the legions, whose pay had to be increased constantly to prevent them from deserting or crowning a rival general. And then there was the Annona, the free grain dole. Over 200,000 Roman citizens received free food from the state. Add to this the cost of the circuses, the gladiatorial games and chariot races designed to distract a restless, unemployed urban population, and you have a recipe for fiscal disaster. The Roman budget was in a permanent deficit. The Emperor Nero was the first to blink. In 64 AD, a massive fire destroyed much of Rome. Nero needed to rebuild the city, and he wanted to build his golden house, a palace of unimaginable luxury. He looked at the imperial treasury and saw it was empty. He couldn't raise taxes without risking a revolt. He couldn't borrow money because there was no global bond market. So he looked at the coins. He realized that if he melted down the existing denarii and mixed in just a little bit of copper, he could mint more coins than he started with. He reduced the silver content from 98% to 94%. He also reduced the weight of the coin. It was the first quantitative easing in history. Nero wasn't creating wealth. He was stealing purchasing power from everyone who held Roman money. The effect was subtle at first. Most people didn't notice that their coins were 4% less pure. But the precedent was set. The printing press had been discovered. For the next 100 years, every time an emperor faced a crisis, a plague, a border skirmish, or a restless army, he turned to the mint. By the time of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the silver content had dropped to 75%. Aurelius, the philosopher who wrote about the virtues of stoicism and honesty, was presiding over a currency that was becoming a lie. The Roman economy was becoming financialized. The focus shifted from trade and production to the manipulation of the money supply. The true collapse began with the Severan dynasty in 193 AD. Septimius Severus, a hard-nosed military general, gave his sons a piece of advice on his deathbed. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. To enrich the soldiers, he needed more money than Rome had ever possessed. He slashed the silver content of the denarius to 50%. This was the tipping point. When the money is half fake, the psychology of the market changes. Merchants began to realize that the silver they were being paid with was turning a dull, reddish color as the copper underneath began to oxidize. They weren't stupid. They knew that if the money was worth half as much, they had to double their prices. This is the birth of the inflationary spiral. As prices rose, the soldiers' pay, even though it had been increased in nominal terms, could buy less and less. The soldiers demanded more. The emperor, desperate to avoid a coup, debased the currency further to pay them. This triggered even higher prices. It was a feedback loop of destruction. By the year 250 AD, the denarius was no longer silver. It was a bronze coin with a thin silver wash that wore off after a few weeks in a merchant S pouch. The silver content had dropped to less than 5%. In the span of a single lifetime, the Roman currency had lost 95% of its value. Think about what this does to a society. When the money fails, everything else fails with it. Long-term investment stopped. Why would a merchant build a new ship or a farmer plant a new vineyard if the profit he earned would be worthless by the time the cargo arrived or the grapes were harvested? People began to hoard real wealth. Old coins from the time of Augustus, gold jewelry, and land. The velocity of money slowed to a crawl. The middle class, the backbone of the Roman bureaucracy and the officer corps, was wiped out. They had their savings in denarii, and those savings turned to dust. As the economy collapsed, so did the political stability of the empire. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was a 50-year nightmare of civil war and plague. Between 235 and 284 AD, there were at least 26 barracks emperors. Most were generals who seized power by promising the troops more money, only to be murdered by those same troops when the debased currency failed to buy enough food. The empire fractured into 3 separate pieces. The borders were left unguarded. The Great Walls were no longer enough to stop the Germanic tribes, who realized that the Roman soldiers were now just hungry men in rusty armor. The final insult came from the government itself. As the currency became worthless, the state could no longer collect taxes and money because the money wasn't worth the cost of transporting it. So the Roman government began to collect taxes in kind. They sent soldiers to farms to seize grain, wine, and oil directly. They turned into a command economy. To ensure they had enough people to tax, they passed laws forbidding farmers from leaving their land and forbidding sons from leaving their fathers' professions. The free citizen of Rome was becoming a serf. The light of the ancient world was flickering out, not because of a foreign invasion, but because the government had broken the most sacred trust of all, the value of the labor of its people. By the year 284 AD, the Roman Empire was no longer a functioning state. It was a crime scene. The currency, once the silver standard of the world, was a hollow shell of copper and tin. The social contract was in tatters, and the military had become a revolving door of assassins and usurpers. It was at this moment that a man named Diocletian seized the throne. Diocletian was not a philosopher like Marcus Aurelius. He was a pragmatic, ruthless administrator who understood that the empire was physically too large and economically too broken to survive in its current form. He realized that the chaos of the 3rd century had been fueled by a lack of central control. His solution was to transform the Roman Empire into a total, managed economy. If the market would not behave, he would force it to. If the people would not accept the worthless money, he would make it a capital offense to refuse it. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued one of the most famous and disastrous economic decrees in human history, the Edict on Maximum Prices. This was a massive document, literally carved into stone across the empire, that attempted to freeze the entire Roman economy in time. It listed price ceilings for over 1,200 commodities and set maximum wages for nearly every profession imaginable. From the price of a bushel of wheat to the daily wage of a bricklayer, a lawyer, or a Latin teacher, every transaction in the empire was now regulated by the state. The rhetoric used to sell this edict sounds eerily modern. Diocletian did not blame his predecessor's money printing for the rising costs of living. He didn't blame the debasement of the denarius. Instead, he blamed the greed of the merchants. He framed inflation as a moral failing of the private sector rather than a mathematical consequence of government policy. The punishment for violating the price caps was death. But even the threat of the sword cannot stop the laws of economics. The result of the edict was an immediate and total disappearance of goods from the market. When the official price for a side of beef was lower than the cost of raising the cow, the farmer simply stopped bringing his cattle to the city. When the cost of transporting grain exceeded the maximum price allowed at the docks, the ships stayed in the harbor. Shortages exploded. Starvation became a reality in the great urban centers. The edict on maximum prices didn't stop inflation. It destroyed the market. People realized that if they wanted to survive, they had to bypass the state entirely. This was the beginning of the flight from the cities. The Roman middle class, the artisans, the shopkeepers, the small business owners, realized that the city had become a trap of high taxes, worthless money, and empty shelves. They began to abandon their homes and flee into the countryside. This migration changed the very DNA of Europe. The wealthy elite, the senatorial class, had already retreated to their massive rural estates known as latifundia. These estates were becoming self-sufficient fortresses. They grew their own food, forged their own tools, and maintained their own private security. As the desperate urban poor arrived at their gates, a new and dark social contract was born. The wealthy lords offered protection and food, but at a terrible price. In exchange for safety, the former free citizens of Rome had to surrender their freedom. They were tied to the land. They became colony, the precursors to the medieval serfs. The government, desperate to keep its tax base, passed laws making these roles hereditary. If your father was a farmer on a lord's estate, you were a farmer. If your father was a baker, you were a baker. The social mobility that had made Rome great was replaced by a rigid, stagnant caste system. The Roman Empire was no longer a vibrant trade network. It was a collection of isolated feudal islands waiting for the end. Enter Constantine the Great. Often celebrated for Christianizing the empire, Constantine was also a master of economic triage. He realized the denarius was dead. It was a joke. So he introduced a new gold coin, the solidus. The name meant solid. It was 4.5 grams of pure gold. But here was the catch. The solidus was for the elite. It was for the soldiers, the bureaucrats, and the wealthy. The common people were left to trade in the bubbleand coins, base metals with almost no value. This created a two-tiered society. The government and the army operated on a gold standard, protecting them from inflation, while the peasantry and the urban poor were left with trash money that lost value every day. This is the definition of Cantillon effect in action. Those closest to the source of new money, the state, thrive, while those at the bottom are slowly crushed by the loss of purchasing power. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out carcass. The tax system was so brutal and the currency so worthless that many Roman citizens actually welcomed the barbarian invaders. In the letters of the era, we see Romans writing that they would rather be slaves to the Goths than citizens of Rome, because the Goths didn't tax them into starvation. When the Visigoths under Alaric finally breached the walls of Rome in 410 AD, they didn't find a defiant superpower. They found a city of ghosts, the unconquerable legions. Legions didn't fight because they hadn't been paid in anything of value for decades. The empire didn't fall to a superior military force. It fell because the people had stopped believing in the system. The money had failed, then the law had failed, and finally the spirit had failed. Now we turn our gaze to the mirror. As we stand in 2026, the global financial architecture is showing the exact same stress fractures. We are currently witnessing a global debt bubble that has surpassed $315 trillion, nearly 333% of global GDP. Just as the Roman emperors faced the impossible choice between cutting spending or debasing the currency, modern central banks are trapped in a debt trap. Since 1971, when the US dollar was severed from the gold standard, the world has been living in a Nero era. We have printed digital currency at a rate that would make the Roman mints look like toys. In the last 6 years alone, the global money supply has expanded by nearly 40%. This is the clipping of the 21st century. We are seeing the return of managed economies. Governments in 2025 and 2026 are increasingly discussing price caps on essential goods, blaming corporate greed for the very inflation their own central banks created. The Roman warning is a whisper across 1,600 years of history. It tells us that an empire's strength is not in its monuments, but in the integrity of its exchange. When the currency becomes a lie, the language of human cooperation breaks down. Trust is the most valuable commodity in any civilization, and it is the first thing that inflation destroys. As the global reserve currency, the US dollar, faces its denarius moment, we must ask, are we prepared for the dark age that follows the death of a currency? Or will we learn at the 11th hour that you cannot print prosperity, you can only print poverty? The barbarians at the gates are never the real threat. The real threat is the emperor with a handful of copper and a plan to call it gold. The cycle is repeating. The question is, will you be inside the walls when they fall, or will you have found your own solidus before the light goes out?